Hello and welcome to the Empowering Women podcast. And as we release this today, it is a very special day. It is International Women's Day. So I hope everyone is enjoying this day and you're celebrating all the amazing women in your life. And today we're going to dig into a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's actually one that I think holds women back sometimes, and that is strategic leadership. And we have an absolute powerhouse for this conversation. Janet Polach is a global authority in executive coaching, team development, and leadership. And she recently released her second book, The Strategic Leader's Mindset. And I cannot wait to dive in. So welcome, Janet, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. And what a terrific introduction, Shannon. And to be doing this on National Women's Day is so exciting. Thanks.
It is exciting. I love this day, one of my favorite days of the year. So if for those who follow our podcast, they all know that I love to start with a story. So let's start learning more about you, Janet. So tell us more about your journey and what brought you to where we are today.
Well, actually, Shannon, the Marine Corps brought me to where I am today. I graduated from college in the middle of the year with a teaching degree. Little did I know when I was 21 years old that there was a recession going on. So finding a job was very, very difficult. Had I found a job, I probably would have gotten laid off the next year. So I looked for something else, and the something else ended up being the military. I looked at all four services, and the Marine Corps recruiters were just outstanding. They pushed all my buttons about belonging and esprit and being the few and the proud. When I joined the Marine Corps, women were still not in combat roles, but I feel very satisfied that the women that I served with back in the 80s and 90s all did a fabulous job, which now enables women to fill all roles in the military, combat roles, aircraft roles. And that is really, really exciting. And so the time that we put in doing a great job made a big difference. And I think that makes a big difference for all of us in the workplace now, especially when we're in these male-dominated roles or organizations, that it's about doing a great job. It's not about being perfect, but it's about doing a great job. And what the Marine Corps taught me was leadership. What does great leadership look like? And that leadership can be developed. And so I really have spent the rest of my life helping leaders thrive, helping them understand what their voice is, helping them discover who they want to be as a leader, and then helping them make things happen in their organizations.
It's interesting that you say that. So I'm reading a book right now by Simon Sinek. It's not a recent book. It's called Leaders Eat Last. And he talks about the Marine Corps in that book. He references it so far. I'm not done yet, but he references it quite a few times in terms of the circle of trust is what he calls it, and how that's so important. So it's really funny how life intersects that way. And you spent your, I'll call it early professional life in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I did. It was very satisfying.
Did you feel that sense of belonging once you were in the Marine Corps?
You know, I felt a sense of belonging. I understood what was expected. I understood, how to be a Marine officer. And yet women during that time were in such, I guess, minimal roles. I was an HR person. We were in supply chain. We were in intelligence. And so you couldn't fully get into the game. And so that felt, that was just a little bit tough. And sadly, Desert Storm came along, and in my opinion, that changed everything, because we deployed all of our women in all these roles, and they just did a fabulous job in combat situations, and then everything changed.
No, well, you, along with many other women, helped break that barrier. So thank you for that. And I'm sure the women that are serving today would say the same. Well, before we dig into the strategic leader's mindset, as I mentioned on the outset, this is your second book. And I believe in July of 2021, you released your first book, which is entitled The 7 Mistakes New Managers Make. And I will put a link to that in the show notes as well. And I just have this guess that many of our audience members are either have been managers or are currently managers, and they can really relate. I know I can relate. So I was actually really excited for this question. What is the premise of that book?
Well, it's really helping leaders be great leaders. So many of us, and Shannon, my guess is that you were in this same boat, that you were a great individual contributor. And so somebody said, oh, you can be a supervisor, or better yet, you can be a manager, and said, ta-da, here you go. If we
And you're like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Exactly, exactly. If we drew a Venn diagram and said individual contributors and managers, the skills don't overlap very much, maybe 20 or 30%. And yet, that is what American industry at least does over and over and over again. We don't prepare leaders, and so they're left to making mistakes. So, this book was intended for people who are new to leadership. Maybe they've been in leadership and it's not feeling very comfortable. The basic things about blocking and tackling of being a good people leader, giving feedback, setting performance expectations,
Mm.
developing people in their role. And so that's really what that first book was all about.
I wish I would have known about it. Well, it didn't exist probably actually when I started. I'm a little farther along in my career, but I wish. I actually think I have some new leaders on my team, so heads up, this book may be landing on your desk just so you
Great.
can another developmental opportunity. I know they're going to love to hear me say that. So, since this podcast is really focused on women, just one quick follow up question to that. Can you share maybe one of the mistakes that this book addresses that you've seen women particularly fall prey to? And then what's one tactic that they can use to address it?
Yeah, thanks. I think as women, we tend to overwork issues. We're afraid to make mistakes. I think we feel that the spotlights are particularly on us as women. And so we want everything to be right. And I think when we do that, we maybe miss opportunities. We maybe miss the opportunity to demonstrate our decisiveness. And so the remedy for that, or a strategy to overcome that, is to set deadlines, to say, okay, boy, I'd love 2 weeks on this issue, but I don't have it. I'm going to have a preliminary decision by Thursday. Put it boldly on your calendar, color code it so you know that it's there. And, know that when we make decisions, we're not alone. You can talk to your boss, you can talk to your colleagues, you can get good perspective, you can talk to your coach, get good perspective about decisions, and you don't have to go it alone.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I can see that from two ways. One, I've felt that spotlight. So, like, for example, I'll give a really good example right now. So, I do have a female leader, but all my colleagues are male. So,
Mhm.
all the colleagues on my direct staff are male. I have had some female leaders that work for me, but I do feel like in many cases the spotlight is a little brighter. And so I can see the tendency to overthink and overwork. I think that's the word that you used on figuring that out. I think that's totally true. And what you made me think about was when you do that, you also squelch creativity, your own creativity, as well as the creativity of those on your team or those around you.
So well said. Absolutely.
All right, I'm gonna have to think about that because I'm actually overworking a decision right now.
So set a
So for those
timeline.
of you that are new in leadership, it never goes away because this is not my first rodeo. So great advice from Janet. Oh, that's just so fun.
Yeah.
So like I promised, we're gonna get into strategic leadership. This is actually one of my passion points. And we just mentioned you just released your second book. It's called The Strategic Leader's Mindset. And for our listeners, I'll put that in the show notes too. And I have not done it yet, but I'm sure writing a book is quite a labor of love, especially the second time around because you sort of know what you're getting into. So,
Yeah.
what prompted you to dive into a second book?
Well, it took a while. I wrote the first book during COVID because I had some
Mhm.
time, and I leveraged a lot of the content that I already had from blog posts and from workshops that I have facilitated and so forth. This second book came to me slowly because I didn't want to do another how-to book, and it's not a competency book at all. What I discovered in looking at lots of 360s and dealing with lots of executives in my coaching practice is that they struggle with that transition from
Mhm.
director, senior director to vice president. They struggle still in the day-to-day operation and interaction because that's frankly what got them there. That's what they got promoted.
Mm.
And so, as a strategic leader, we're expected to rise above that, to delegate more, to make courageous decisions, to act decisively, and to empower our team even more so. And so, when I discovered it's really about thinking differently, not just acting differently, I think that that's the key. And that's what I explored in the book.
That is so true. And I even would take it down a level. I think when you move from one of the hardest transitions I'm learning, honestly, to make is when you go from being just a direct leader of people to being a leader of people leaders, I'll call it that.
Hmm.
It's a whole nother mind shift. Because to your point, that's how you got promoted. You knew how to do things, you knew how to execute. And for those that listen to this podcast know this, I did a pivot 3 years ago to a function that I had no experience in, and I'm leading leaders of people. So
Hmm.
you can't do that. And so now you're sort of like, okay, now what do I do? Where's my value? What do all those things mean?
And I think your value then, Shannon, in that situation, and congratulations for taking that on, is being able to look beyond the here and now. I use the
Mm,
term often in the book over the horizon, and it really is kind of a Marine Corps term because we think about that strategically. And it's thinking about what's happening in 2 years from now, or what's happening in a year from now, or how do I connect my operations roles to marketing, to sales, to customer engagement, and thinking about how what I'm doing is connected to all the other pieces. I think your peer relationships become much, much more important.
mm.
You're getting work done for the organization and not just for your department.
Yeah, I love that. You have to almost be I think I don't remember where I saw this, but a connector, a collector almost of dots,
Hmm.
right? You're
Absolutely.
constantly collecting and connecting dots. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Hmm.
Well, I might have actually just stole my next question, but I'm going to do it because I want to hear the answer. So tell me how you define strategic leadership. What does that look like for you?
Well, it's a holistic approach. You have a much broader context. So you're thinking about, marketing and industry trends, competitor analysis, what customers need. You're much more outward focused from your organization than inward focused to getting things actually done.
Hmm. How do you think that looks in like, and well, since you were an HR role in the military, how do you look at that from a people standpoint? Because I can see that what you're saying from like a product or a process standpoint. What do you
Mhm.
think that looks like from a people standpoint?
Well, I think first of all, you get your people out into the community, into the industry, sending them to conferences and expecting them to network while they're there,
Mm,
asking them what they've learned when they get back after you've spent the $2,000 or $3,000 on their industry event. I think it's encouraging them to be involved in their community, whether it's volunteering or sitting on a board of a nonprofit, but they get a sense about what's going on all around me. I think, especially when a business is growing, it's so easy to get insulated. And I talk to executives time and time again who got laid off, or maybe there was a merger and there were two marketing heads and they don't need that second marketing head. And they say, Janet, I've been working so hard on being a great leader. I've lost all my contacts. And so they're
mm,
starting in this transition almost from square one. And so I think as a strategic leader, having that mindset of what's going to happen next, what's happening after this year, once things settle down in the economy, then what is the opportunity that's created? It does require us to do some guessing and some probabilities. But it's okay to think about what are the two or three scenarios rather than just the one path that might happen.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I have been lucky enough in my day job to be in a growth business, and I think that absolutely happens because you have things coming at you quickly. They typically have more urgent timelines, I'll call it. So it's hard, right, to kind of pull back and say,
Hmm.
oh, okay, let me think about 18 months from now when I'm staring at something that I have to have an answer by tomorrow for, or
Very
it's
true.
gonna have drastic consequences, right? Shutting a production line down or something to that effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shannon, what I'm learning from my leaders and talking to them about is setting time for strategic thinking. I think
Mm,
it's the number one and easiest ways to get there because you're right. Even at your level, you're still dealing with day-to-day issues. And so setting time on your calendar ahead of time, you can't do it yet this week. You can't probably do it next week because your calendar is full, but blocking working time to say, all right, what is this industry going to do in the next couple of years? What are the opportunities for my products or my operation that we haven't gotten to that we must get to? And so that strategic time, it's not just, sitting back in a chair and kind of letting your mind wander. It's also very deliberate. Sometimes my clients will spend that time making a strategic presentation, really having the mind time to think about how do I convince others to make this investment. And so it's that, Stephen Covey was great on the four quadrant model, urgent and important. It's really in that important but not urgent quadrant of that
mm.
four corner quadrant model.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because we're in a world that's change is driving faster and faster. And I think we get too stuck in the urgent quadrant to your point, like
Mhm.
that. It's sort of like being on the crazy news cycle or something to that
Mhm.
effect. Just on the news cycle in your own company and dealing with the urgent and not the important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what strategic leaders have to do, and that's how they deliver for their organization. And it's not every single day all the time, but what we know about the way the brain operates is it's nearly impossible for us to switch in the moment from tactical to strategic. So to be strategic, you really have to set time aside to do it.
You made me feel better because I've been getting some strategic questions at work, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, and I'm actually actually, that's where I like being in the strategic thought,
Hmm.
but I'm like, I don't know. I've just dealt with these three other problems right now, and I couldn't tell you.
Hmm.
Oh,
But I
that's
think,
just
Shannon,
funny.
what you
That's
can
interesting.
say is, I can't tell you right now, but let me block some time to think about this.
Yeah, good point. There's some piece of advice. If you're listening and you're driving, don't stop. But when you get to your destination, write that one down. That's some great advice. Oh, you may have covered this, but you may have some other ideas. Why do you think it's tough for leaders to pivot towards strategic leadership? You mentioned earlier people kind of get stuck in
Hmm.
that pivot point.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Oh, the question is, people get stuck in that
Yeah,
pivot point for strategic
yeah.
leadership. Why do you think they get stuck in that
Oh,
pivot
why
point?
do they get stuck?
Yeah,
I think because
good
they're
problem.
just so good at the day-to-day stuff. Shannon, you're a great problem solver. You know your business well, and so it's easy for you to become the go-to person to say, boss, what should we do about X, Y, and Z? Now you know what this client did, or what have you. And it's just so easy for us to get stuck in that moment of, oh, I can solve this really quickly, and then everything can move on. When you do that, you are not offloading some of your day-to-day tasks to other people and you're not developing them. I had some great interviews in the book with leaders who've made that transition.
Hmm.
And I had one leader towards the very end of the book talk to me about her transition, and I'd been working with her for many months and during her transition from director to vice president. And she said, really at a vice president level, it's all about people leadership. It's about developing your team, helping them learn more, getting them excited about the work that they do so that they deliver on behalf of the firm. My job is to make sure that happens.
Hmm. That's a good one to sit with. I'm going to sit with that one, Jana, when we get off the phone.
Yeah.
It's an interesting perspective because I like two things in my job. I like the strategy thought process, and that's more around, I'm going to call it product strategy, I'll call it. But then my other love is people strategy. And I
Mhm.
never as much connected the intersection until you just said that. So that's an interesting thought for me.
Yeah.
So in this book, if I understand it correctly, you cover 7 transformative ways of thinking that are essential for effective leadership and more strategic roles. So I want to give our listeners just a little sneak peek of what that looks like. Can
Mhm.
you share one of those ways and then one that may be particularly relevant for women?
I think one of them is listening more than talking. It's really interesting. I observe over and over executives who feel that they have to say everything in the meeting. And then, employees kind of roll their eyes and say, well, why are we even here? So I think getting into the habit of setting the expectation for a group conversation and then you being the last to speak rather than the first to speak. It's a
Mm.
little bit like the Simon Sinek thing about leaders eat last. It's I'm at the back of the line instead of the front. But that doesn't mean that you abdicate your responsibility. It means that you're allowing people to share their perspective, share their insights. After all, they know a lot more about the work than we do as a strategic leader. And so it's giving them the chance to solve the problem, to developing them right in the spur of the moment, and then giving them guidance.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I have trouble with that one, by the way. I have to like put duct tape over my mouth and be like, okay, you need to be quiet.
Mhm, mhm.
But it's really interesting because I think, at least maybe not quite at the director level, I might back it down a level, but I think, especially for new leaders or maybe leaders that aren't as seasoned, they think they have to have all the answers.
Mhm.
And that
Absolutely.
compounds, I think, what you're talking about. Would you agree or disagree?
I think that does compound what they're that people believe they do. We and employees do expect their manager to know absolutely everything about their job. There's just that expectation, but it's not a reasonable expectation. And
Mm.
Shannon, you're a great example of moving to a whole different department and indeed thriving, even though you haven't done everybody's jobs. And I think we see that more and more. And so being able to suspend that idea that I need to know every single thing about this and because I don't need to know because everybody around me knows. And so
Yeah.
finding ways to tap in to their knowledge and their know-how and experience.
Yeah, but I love what this is like leading me up to as I'm hearing what you're saying. It's really a huge mindset shift. It's a
Mhm,
mindset shift toward directionality, providing direction, encouragement, getting people to think creatively. It's a whole
mhm.
different mindset shift. That's how it's feeling to me.
And that's what the book is about. It's
Okay.
really the mindset. Because you're right, you can't just keep doing things and expecting yourself to be strategic. You really have to step back and let others influence the process, and that's then how you develop them.
I love that. That is awesome. I've learned so much on this podcast, and we're obviously on video. If you're listening to us, we're on video too. So I can't really take notes, but like my brain is like taking like 50 notes right now. I've
Great.
had my own coaching session, Janet, whether you know it or not.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
um, I'm curious, you wrote this from a place where you've obviously done it yourself. So
Mhm.
my next question is, you've moved into strategic leader roles. What was your own struggle and how did you address it?
Well, I think I retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. And, being a lieutenant colonel is a lot different than being a captain. A captain is more
Mm.
junior. And so, it is a strategic role. I got a chance to be in the command center during Desert Storm.
Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
you know, thinking about how do you think, at this level rather than at the tactical level. And what I saw, at least in the Marine Corps, and I think all the other services do this really well, that we learned that, you can't call all the individual shots from the United States when the business, the company, when the situation is someplace else in the world. And
Mm.
so it's setting the direction, it's making sure people have the resources that they need, and then kind of getting out of the way and letting them run it the way they need to run it because they're right on the ground doing the work.
So did you find yourself initially trying to get too involved, even when you were maybe half the world away, so to say?
Oh, I think so. And it happens all the time, and I
Mm.
think in the military, it's even worse because, we literally wear our rank on our collars, and
Mm.
it's hard to push back to a senior leader to say, boss,
Mm.
I have a better way. Or, why do you really need that information? And I was in an airplane recently with another, I didn't realize it. He was flying into Tucson to visit the base down here, and he was lieutenant colonel. And I talked about the strategic mindset. And I said, we get so used to telling people in the military, this is how you should do it. Here's the next step and the next step. And yet, at the strategic level, you really can't be in those kind of details because the situation is changing too quickly.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about that. And unlike the corporate world, it's not
Mhm.
a life, typically, it's not a life or death situation. The military, and especially in wartime, is very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to split subjects on you a little bit. So, as we mentioned on the intro, today is International Women's Day as we release this podcast, and the theme this year is accelerate action. And so, I'm curious, what does accelerate action mean to you?
Well, I think it's acting courageously. It's being willing to, and I have a whole chapter in the book about acting courageously. And I talk to a lot
Mm.
of executives in my coaching sessions about how are they acting courageously. And it's really standing up and saying that the emperor has no clothes, or we tried this idea 5 years ago and it didn't work then. Is it a good idea now? And if so, what has really changed? I think women sometimes struggle with going up against the grain because they work so hard to get where they're at and they don't want to mess anything up. And
Mm.
yet, I think the great women that we all know and that we've met, and many of them that you've profiled, Shannon, on the podcast, are the ones who broke the mold, are
Yep.
the one who said this just doesn't work. And for us as leaders, I think it's important to capture those courageous thinkers, and so that they don't leave the organization and start their own company, because we need
Mm.
them in our organization and we need to encourage them and reinforce them when they stand up and say, you know what, this isn't going to work.
It's interesting you say that. I don't have, I mean, I have a decent sized team, and it's one of the things I've been really focused on is creating a space where people feel empowered. I don't really like that word, but they feel empowered to push back. They feel empowered to say, okay, I understand this is where we're going. Can you say more about this? Or I'm a little concerned about this. And I will tell you, it's kept me out of trouble multiple times as a leader. When I have one person in my head in particular, and she's very good about asking the hard question. And I have to actually sit there and go, you know what? I haven't thought about that. Say more. Like,
Mhm.
tell me more. And it's
Yep.
it's a very it creates so much conversation and a much better work culture, and it also gets us to a better place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any other advice for women to accelerate action in their workplace and communities? I didn't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
Well, what I found where I could be successful in industry or in the military was figuring out who I was and how I wanted to show up.
Hmm.
Especially as I became more senior, I was a mother, a mother of two children who are now grown, and they were very much a part of who I am and how I show up as a leader. I have a very aged mother who's 95 years old,
Oh
and
gosh.
she's, in my life, not full time because my sister, thank goodness, takes care of her, but, that I'm available as needed. And so that's who I am. That is what has informed me. And I think when women try to shut all that outside stuff out and kind of just grin and bear it, even though, one of the kids has pneumonia or RSV or whatever, I think we let ourselves down and we're not as effective as a leader.
That is so true. And I think as women, we just say, forget about all this stuff behind the curtain that's going on.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's funny. I'm actually doing that right now. I won't provide details, but there's some bits of personal stuff going on. And I just went to a staff meeting this morning, and I think people could tell, hey, she's not
Hmm.
100% with it. And I
Hmm.
didn't say like
Yeah,
what's going on in the background. So it's really interesting. So to
yeah,
show up fully, and that's not
yeah. I
always
think
easy to
so,
do.
fully. Yeah, it absolutely isn't easy to do. And I don't think, Shannon, I don't know what your situation is, but whatever it is, you don't have to give all the details.
Right.
And yet you can say, one of my kids is really struggling right now. And so I'm a little bit distracted. So let's see, what can I put aside right now to help being fully present right now?
Hmm. Be a full human. And I know,
Yes,
and that sounds
absolutely.
so easy, but I think for many of us men and women, that's not exactly easy. Well, those are some great advice. I feel like I'm getting a lesson, Janet, and I can't take notes. So I'm just envious of the people listening that can't take notes. All right, I have one final question, and it's my personal favorite. I ask it every time. What is one piece of advice or a quote that you would like to leave with our listeners?
I think the advice is have a buddy. Find someone, and it doesn't have to be another female necessarily, but someone outside of your family that you can rely on to talk about issues and perspectives. I coach a lot of CEOs, and they will tell you that it's really lonely. They usually have a significant other in their life who they can talk to, but that person gets kind of tired of the problems. So coaches certainly do that, but I think a cheaper way, if you don't have the funding, is to find a really good buddy. Share articles, share situations that you're facing, and test out your thinking with someone else who knows the situation before you take that courageous step because it may or may not be right.
It's some great advice, and just FYI, I have a leadership coach too. So,
Yeah,
and you're right, it's not always the cheapest option, but it's certainly helpful as you're trying to grow and figure things out. It's a great
yeah,
piece of advice.
great.
Yep,
Thank you.
I love that one. So, Janet, as we wrap up, where can folks find you, and where can they purchase your new book? It's exciting.
So my book is available on Amazon, and that's
Okay.
probably the easiest place to get a hold of it. If you're thinking about a small leadership development program for your organization or you're interested in one-on-one coaching, our conversation today was a lot like coaching. That's what coaching sounds like. I think people think a coach is going to tell you all the answers, and really what we do is invite questions for your own reflections. And it can be a few months, it can be many months. But Shannon, I'm so glad to hear that you do have a coach that's supporting your success. So people can find me at janetpolach.com.
Okay, perfect. You are you on LinkedIn or any other social that
Yes,
you're pretty active on?
yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and
Okay,
you can
perfect.
find me very easily there.
All right. So a book on Amazon, janetpollock.com, and then go to LinkedIn. Well, Janet, thank you for celebrating International Women's Day with me and with our empowering women community. Much appreciated. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Shannon. Thank you so much.
Well, listeners, I will see you soon. Next episode coming in a few weeks. Bye, everybody.